The old adage that the value of the fur, beaver in this instance, is predetermined when the animal is in the trap, and nothing can change that, could never be more wrong. In fact, the value is determined long before the pelt is harvested. The traps you select, the way they are prepared and set, all have a very strong influence on the value of that pelt. To say nothing of the season you choose to harvest. When you think about it, the harvester has a tremendous amount of impact on the value of their beaver pelts, long before a trap is even set. Let's start with timing your harvest. As you can see by the patterns on the leather, primeness is a progression regulated by day length. Shortening day length primes the fur. The darker areas are coming on prime, while the lighter areas are fully prime. If primeness were the main harvesting and grading criteria, those harvested in late December through early March would be the best. As a rule, a harvester can expect beaver taken prior to November 1st will tend to grade silky. Those harvested later in mid-December will most likely grade semi-heavy, and after December 20th would probably receive the heavy grade. By mid-March, and as soon as the water reopens in the spring, the beaver starts to shed both underfur and guard hairs. Spring beaver also may have a problem with damage. Most spring beaver will not grade higher than slight, and the harvester should pull his traps as soon as he sees too much bite damage. Harvesters should know the market and trap accordingly. It makes no sense to harvest fall beaver when the market for silkies is limited, and waiting an additional 3 weeks will bring you a good marketable semi-heavy pelt. There are many factors that determine when the best time to harvest beaver are, and later we will explain how timing affects the grade of pelts. This one is easy. Use properly sized traps, keep them clean, and set them to minimize damage. Never use rusty traps, as even underwater, the rust will mark the fur. It's a simple job to keep your traps speed dip treated. Just dip them at the end of the season before you put them away. Body grippers are best used in 8 or 10-inch configurations, although 7-inch openings have their place. The newer series traps prevent the springs from sliding down the jaws and go a long way in preventing pelt damage. Strive for a quick kill across the neck just behind the head. This keeps the fur impact at a minimum. To facilitate this type of catch, trigger placement is critical. Ideally, the trigger should be on the bottom with the wires in the middle of the trap. If the trap can't be set with the trigger on the bottom, the dog can be offset on the jaws with the trigger bent across the opening of the trap.
And this is an improperly set conibear trap. The best way to set a conibear in this respect is you have the dog and everything on the bottom, so that when the trap fires that's coming up to the belly.
With the triggers on top, both the dog and the trigger will skin off guard hairs and even underfur. And this is even more exaggerated in the springtime, skinning them in the worst possible place, behind the head, where the grader's hand goes when he weighs the pelt. If the trigger must be set on top, offset it to one side and bend the wires across the opening, sometimes extending the trigger wires. Foot restraining traps should always be set to drown the beaver as quickly as possible. Any other arrangement increases the possibility of damaging the pelt. Not only physically, but mud and debris can be very difficult to clean. All snaring should be done under the ice. This facilitates quick drowning and minimal damage to the pelt. Snares should be anchored on the bottom of the pole and tended regularly to prevent the beaver from rising to the top and freezing in the ice. The colder the weather, the more often you should tend. Snares for beaver should never be set in open water unless the beaver can be drowned quickly. The longer a beaver is in the snare, the more severe the pelt damage.
Once again, snare mark on a beaver. We see the blood hemorrhaging on the leather side, and we know right away that there's going to be damage to the underfur on the fur side.
Field cleaning your beaver is another very important step in maintaining high-quality pelts. Poorly cleaned pelts and trap damage are 2 top reasons trappers lose money. This is where the experienced trapper makes a difference.
The most common problem we see in beavers shipped to the auction are trappers not properly washing and cleaning their beaver before they put them up. This presentation is not only important to the graders, but particularly to the buyers.
If you capture the beaver in a body-gripping trap, be sure the trap is not frozen in the fur. If so, take it home, trap and all, and let it thaw. Remove the trap the same way as if there were ice on the fur from being frozen in. Don't try to pull the ice off. Take the beaver and the ice home and let it thaw in a warm, not hot location. Do not try to pull the ice off the fur. If the ice chunks are big, put the beaver back under water and leave him for a while. Much of the large chunks will slip off. Cut snares off quickly before they freeze in the fur. Always cut the snare on the belly side or under the chin. Slide the cutters in and up, then cut. This avoids cutting the guard hairs and down into the fur. If not possible, take the beaver back to the skinning shed, let it thaw, then cut. Never lay your wet beaver on the ice. It will freeze the guard hairs into the ice immediately. And when you pick it up, the fur stays frozen to the ice. In fall and spring, be sure to thoroughly clean the beaver in clean brook water, a stream, or a pond. Take them home and hose them off if the beaver is especially muddy. Another way is to find an open brook with some current and tie or stake the beaver in the current. You can even leave them there for several hours, letting the water thoroughly clean the pelt. In the winter, snow is a great fur cleaner. Just keep rolling and rubbing the beaver in the snow. It will dry and clean the pelt pretty well. Almost all drowned beaver bleed from the nose. A little bit on the nose is not a problem. If you have a good catch, don't stack the beaver up. Avoid getting blood on the fur of the other beaver. Either keep them one layer high and not touching, or wrap the nose with something to absorb the blood. Old socks work well for this. Just slip it over the beaver's head. A lot of trappers carry old fur bags with them when they are tending. Bagging the beaver keeps the fur clean and from freezing to the toboggan or truck bed. Back at the fur shed, if you get blood on the fur, wash it with warm water. Some trappers use a little Dawn dish detergent. Baking soda also works. The next important step is drying the beaver. This can be done on racks or by hanging them in a cool area with a good fan on them. They should be hung head down so blood doesn't drain to the base of the tail and get on the pelt. Dry them thoroughly. This is important because wet spots on the fur can cause snags when the pelt is fleshed, especially if you're using a beam. It is best to put your beaver up as soon as possible. If you need to keep your beaver unskun, they will keep for a couple of days in a cool location and should be left laying on their back. This prevents any taint that might occur from coming in contact with the thin stomach muscle through the belly fur. Once the pelt is dried, brush out the fur. Be very thorough. Carefully remove any large pills in the fur that can cause snagging of the fleshing knife.
You can feel them for any burrs or pills, or anything that would catch when you were fleshing that would cause a tear in the pelt from the knife.
Any good dog brush works well, along with a finer curing brush or a heavy comb. Pitch is another matter.
It's better if the pitch can be removed by the trappers as much as possible, because if the pelts lay around for an extended length of time, what happens is it solidifies and becomes even more difficult for us to remove it. And the best way I could think of would probably be to use paint thinner or something like that, a solvent, to be able to dissolve the resin of the pitch.
Here is a list of key points. Know your markets. Harvest beaver when they are at their optimum value. Keep your traps clean and in good working order. Set them for quick, humane kills. Field clean your beaver fur and protect it in transport. Clean your beaver. Clean your beaver. Clean your beaver. Never pull ice out of the fur. Dry the fur before skinning your beaver. This section is not intended as an absolute blueprint on how to handle beaver. It's rather a pool of different techniques and ideas that are intended to help the fur handler improve their skills. As you will see, there are several very effective and efficient ways to put up your pelts. For the fur handler, it's just a matter of finding a technique that you're comfortable with and yields a finished pelt that meets the buyer's expectations and the grader's requirements. There are two basic ways to skin a beaver. Probably the most common is rough skinning, where the pelt is removed from the carcass along with the fat and meat. Clean skinning is where the pelt is removed, leaving as much of the fat and meat on the carcass as possible. Again, either way works. It's just a matter of which one you are most comfortable using. Before starting, it's important to be aware of the potential health risks involved with handling wild fur, and it's widely recommended that fur handlers wear gloves when skinning. Beaver are relatively free of diseases that may affect the handler. The most common one that we've all heard of is beaver fever, or Giardia. This is a protozoa, a small single-celled organism that is passed in beaver droppings and is usually picked up by drinking contaminated water, but can also be picked up in the intestinal tract, often by accidentally cutting into it during skinning. The good news is that it's very treatable, but you will get pretty sick until you figure out what you've got. One thing to guard against is your dog picking it up. They can and do get it, especially young dogs. It's very tough on them and they're very susceptible. You'll notice uncontrollable diarrhea, which is easily curable once the vet knows what they have. Beaver can also carry tularemia. This bacteria is highly infectious and can even be picked up through the skin. It doesn't need a cut to infect the fur handler. Gloves and thoroughly washing after skinning are the best defense. This is identified by checking the liver for white cysts that make the liver look like a strawberry. Be sure to check the liver if you intend to eat the beaver meat. Also, roundworms are common but are very species-specific. Beaver only have a few external parasites, and the common ones that the handler sees are the brown and white beaver ticks, and often the little red ones running around in the fur. These are called beaver beetles. These are also species-specific and won't bother you or your pets, and can only live off the host beaver for about a day and won't cause any damage to the fur. If you have a beaver that is heavily infested, just put it in a plastic bag and spray a couple shots of Raid. That will kill them in about an hour. It's important for the fur handler to have an assortment of knives and equipment that can not only do the job, but that he's comfortable using. As you become more proficient, you will often find certain knives or tools work better for the way you like to work. There are many fur handling tools available, and what you use is completely up to you. Later in the DVD, we will show you how to use and sharpen your most useful tools, and a few examples of homemade equipment that others have come up with that have helped them with fur handling. Let's look at the steps in rough skinning. It will be much easier to remove the feet before you start. Use a heavy-bladed cutting knife and twist the legs, then twist the back feet out. The front one should come off easily by cutting through the joint and also using a quick twist. Another method is chopping them with a small hatchet. Lay the beaver on its back, tail towards you. Some guys like to use a cradle, others prefer to skin flat. Either way, make sure the surface is clean and grease-free. Cut around the tail, but not too deep, or you'll lose your carrying handle. If you intend to skin the tail, take it off later. Now, cut from the tail up to the vent and around each side to the top. Not too deep. This is where the casters are located, and you don't want to cut into them. Now take the back of your knife and draw a line from the bottom of the lower lip to the top of the vent. This will help you keep a straight line. You can use a knife, sheetrock knife, or shingle blade to make this cut. If this cut gets too far off center, it may look misshapen when you nail it to the board or overstretched at the short side. It works best with a knife from the vent up to the lip and a shingle blade from the lip back to the vent. Hold the skin taut as you're cutting. This will help keep the cut straight. Don't cut too deep or you'll open the stomach cavity, which makes a mess. Keep the blade under the pelt, but on top of the stomach muscle. This is more likely to happen with a smaller beaver. Once you have opened the pelt, you can reach either side of the cut and pull the pelt apart some to give your knife some room. This is where a good beaver knife with a rounded blade and tip will make the job much easier. Now, start long, easy strokes with the skinner held angled more toward the carcass than the hide. Leave all the fat on the pelt and just move the whole length of the body. Pull the pelt with one hand and slide your knife with the other till the pelt is free of the belly and chest. When you move up to the head, skin down to the jowls on either side, working from the midline cut all the way up to the middle of the lower jaw. One hint just inside the open pelt by the front legs are the front teats. If you take some time and clean skin this area just by changing the angle of your knife, it may save you from hitting them with your fleshing knife and opening a hole in the pelt if you beam the beaver later. Beavers have 4 teats. The females are larger than the males in older beaver. The other two are farther out on the sides of the chest, about 4.5 to 5 inches behind the front ones on the adult beaver. As you reach the vent, it is also good to try to clean skin this area. It is the weakest part of the pelt and is easily torn when you are fleshing the pelt on a beam. Also, the area around the tail is a very oily fat, and when you are beaming the pelt, if this edge is already clean, it saves all that oily fat from getting on the pelt as you push over the back edge. Once you have the pelt removed as far to the side as you can reach, you will be at the legs. Now you want to pull them through the holes where you can remove the legs. This takes a little bit of feel with your hands. You grip the hide on the outside of the leg and roll it up over the leg. Cutting the pelt free from the carcass as you roll, eventually the pelt will be at the end of the leg bone, and just start cutting it free on the opposite side of the leg. Now just continue freeing the pelt around the side of the beaver. When you move up to the head, skin down to the jowls on either side. Working from the midline cut, go all the way up to the middle of the lower jaw. Once you have one side free, turn the beaver and do the same thing on the other side. This time, start at the head and work back, freeing the legs as you go and clean skinning around the vent. Now the beaver is open on the belly side. This is a good time to remove the casters and oil sacs. These lay either side of the vent with the oil sacs lower on the belly. They all open into the vent, which is anatomically named the cloaca. They are both covered by a thin membrane.
Casters, the oil sacs, this is a male. The baculum is the bone in here. The casters and the oil sacs.
You may want to use a sharp-tipped skinning knife. Just lift the membrane and trim away from the top of the casters. Then you can work your fingers in around the backside and just work the casters free of the membrane. It's important to clean all the flesh free from the casters. Be careful, the casters tear easily and will lose their contents, the castoreum, and that's where the value is. Once you have them freed, just cut them off from the surrounding tissue and trim off any excess flesh. Hang them to dry someplace with good air circulation. They should hang only enough to form a dry but pliable skin over the casters about 3 to 4 days. Any longer and you will start to lose castoreum and weight. Be sure you turn them every day or so to get all the parts dry. Then place them in a plastic bag and freeze them. We will examine the casters, their uses and grades a little farther along in the DVD. Most casters have a dried weight of 4 to 6 or 7 ounces occasionally. A large pair, usually from a big male in the late winter or early spring, may weigh close to a pound. These pictures are of some very unusual sets, probably caused by some sort of abnormality in the beaver.
As you can see here, these ones here, that probably would be a record because nobody's ever seen anything like that previously. This here is a total deformity. $60 an ounce, he's going to do okay.
The oil sacs also have value, and they're just below where the casters were. It's not necessary to trim them free of flesh and membrane, but for most lure-making purposes, it's important to extract the oil from the sac while it's fresh. As the oil ages, it almost immediately starts to taint and the odor changes entirely. When you finish skinning the beaver, just open the sacs into a jar and freeze the liquid oil. The shell also has value and can be dried after it's drained. Many trappers use these dried oil sacs for an attractant while canine trapping. With a beaver on its belly, continue to cut the pelt free of the carcass, starting at the sides and moving into the back. Then start at the tail and pull the hide up and over the head as you cut it free. Moving up the back, the carcass has a lot less fat than down the back. There's only a thin layer of meat, so be careful. It's very easy to cut into the pelt in this area. When you reach the back of the head, on each side are the ears. Cut them close to the skull. We will remove them later. You may want to change knives at this point to one that sharpens easily. Much of the rest of the cutting is in contact with the skull and will quickly dull your sharp-edged skinning knife. Continue down the head, working all the way over to the sides and down the cheeks till you've reached the eyes. Here, just change the angle of your knife slightly. Flatten it till you get to the front of the eye. There's a small ridge here that you'll need to cut straight down on a 90-degree angle to free the pelt. Once you have the pelt past the eyes, continue cutting using a slight knife angle toward the hide, working your way from the mouth on one side to the other. Once you're almost to the nose, you'll feel the bone turn to cartilage. It's important to cut the pelt free as close to the bone as possible. Otherwise, the nose will split, making it very difficult to anchor the pelt over the fleshing beam, if that's the way you intend to flesh your pelts. Once you have mastered the skinning technique, skinning competitions are a lot of fun for trapper get-togethers. Keep at it, and someday you may give Jackie Wurz, considered by most to be Canada's champion beaver skinner, a run for his money. Jackie lives in Alberta and handles anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 beaver a season. He's been at it for over 25 years. That's somewhere in the neighborhood of 65,000 beaver. His fastest time at a skinning competition was recorded at 1 minute 57 seconds, which includes taking off the feet and tail. Remember these key points when handling your beaver. Wear gloves. Keep skinning table clean. Skin carefully around the teats. Clean casters well and dry them thoroughly. Clean skin around the vent. Leave the nose intact. The other common way of skinning and preparing is to nail it up right after skinning. This is called a clean skin. The object of this technique is to leave all of the fat and gristle on the carcass and just have a clean pelt when you're finished. Denny Weiss, a long-term director of the Wild Fur Shippers Council, is considered by many to not only be an accomplished trapper, but a world-class fur handler. Denny harvests about 100 beaver in a year in his home state of Iowa. Denny is going to explain his technique for clean skinning beaver.
Biggest trick to clean skinning, one of the things I want to show right away, even though this is a sharp scalpel blade, I want to tune it up a little bit. The trick with these knives, even though I'm tuning this thing up, that thing's got a sharp edge on it that looks just like the edge of this paper towel. But since I'm running my knife this way, I actually want to roll this blade under. So when I sharpen that knife, I want to do at least one, if not two rolls on that side of my knife. By doing that, this sharp blade, instead of being perfectly like that, is actually going to roll that blade just a little bit this way. So now when that blade's down against the hide, it's actually cutting out. I don't want that blade to be rolled this way, so it's going to actually cut right into my fur. Make sure you at least run it once, if not twice, on that side to be able to roll that edge over that way. The biggest trick to clean skinning is to get him started right off the bat, because you can see right here I've got my fat, but I want to make sure I pull it at the right angle, have my knife drawing down so it makes nice clean cuts. I don't want to leave any meat or fat attached, because once I get done with my hides, I want to be able to just wash them and they're ready to nail on the board. Because if you ever get behind and start leaving some fat or meat on, it's hard to ever get it cleaned up or to get yourself back on track. Try to only do about an inch or so at a time. Never get yourself too far ahead in one spot. You want to keep this beaver going pretty even or level. Once I got very much of the hide, now the whole trick is using hand tension. I want to put my fingers like this and kind of roll my knuckles. So I want to start gripping and pulling some pressure on that hide. I don't ever want to use my knife this way. We're always cutting down like this way with our knife. So we're just making cuts like so. Looks like this beaver here is gonna just have got in a fight. We're gonna have an open scar here where this is a spring caught beaver. They're just beginning to start fighting for territory. This lower part of the beaver, right down here, kind of what they'd call his saddle, directly above the beaver's tail. On this side and on his back side is gonna be some of the toughest gristle on the beaver. A lot of guys think you need a rounded beaver knife. I like these Chicago Cuttery steak knives or one of these replaceable scalpel blades, even though they've got a point. We're basically just using that front 1.5 inches or so of the knife. I'm never using this part right down in here to clean skin. We're always right up here on that curvature. But there again, pulling it real tight, keeping that right angle with your knife and just laying your cuts down just to shave that meat and fat off of them. The other thing I should have said, whenever I use a knife, I tell people I don't you don't have very good feel with your knife if you grip your knife like this and try to cut. I always like to put my index finger out on the, at least halfway on this knife. That way it's kind of like my finger, just easing the fat off of here. So I'm going to like to put the pressure on that finger so I've got the right amount of pressure on my knife. Getting to the front leg here, we want to get it etched out of here. Roll our finger. A lot of guys are going to have a dished out or a trough beaver table to be able to roll their beavers all the time, because you want to keep this beaver rolling. But I've used just any kind of a gallon. This is like an antifreeze jug. This works out very good. I'm going to place it right in back of the beaver here. That way I can roll this beaver to whatever angle I need. Use a little bit of belly pressure, or I can turn the jug around this way. But it's very important to keep this angle this way. You never want to cut into your knife like so. So by using this jug here, now I can tilt my beaver up just a little bit, sit here and still get the right angle down on my knife here. You can see how nice a job. We're not going to have any meat or fat left on this when we get done. All of it's going to keep here. You shouldn't, if you're clean skinning a beaver right, you shouldn't be seeing notches on your beaver like that up into the meat. You should just see this, because you're actually just going to be rolling this excess meat off of your beaver. But you need a sharp knife. Roll that edge on it a little bit when you sharpen it, and use lots of tension. I'm going to use my fingers like this. We're actually going to grab a hold of the hide and we're going to roll it. I'm going to roll my fingers like so to get that proper tension on it. The other thing I tell guys, if you start seeing little almost knife etchings in your hide, you're not running your knife at the right angle, and you probably have got your knife edge, your blade too sharp, that you're actually putting little creases in it. When getting around the legs, the front leg or the back leg is always the trick of getting these beavers off, still keeping them clean, but not, because it's real easy to cut a hole in here. So you got to really just take your time, know where that fat is and what's the hide. So once we get that leg cut, now we want to get ourselves caught back up, tease our way down along here to make sure we're not going to leave any fat. Some of the hardest gristle on the beaver is right back here on the saddle, 6, 8, 10 inches up from his tail. It's really the important parts about clean skinning these beavers. Always having your knife sharp, always keeping yourself pretty much in a straight line. Don't get behind in one section and ahead in the other. You'll want to keep rolling this down just an inch or two at a time, and then putting your hands under here and rolling that hide and putting that right tension. We're going to go just about another inch or so on this beaver, get him just a little over midway on the center of his back, and then we're going to flip this beaver around and start back on the other side of his belly. Like I say, we got to roll our hands like that, our knuckles, to put that tension. Always keep this knife running right down along the hide. Okay, so once we got one side clean skinned, I flip that beaver around. Pretty much the same thing. We start all over, working our way up and back down. Just tugging at it very slowly and gently to get him started. Because starting these beaver off is an important part here. We don't want to start with any meat or fat on the hide, so we got to get ourselves off to a good start here. Take care of the nipple areas on them. We're going to meet kind of in the middle here of him. You can see I've just started, we're just freeing him up all the way down the center line here. Okay, so we've flipped him up, we've fleed him up here. Now we're going to flip the beaver over on his belly. You can see we pretty much got him all done except right up here on his head area. So we've got the beaver all done. You can see this is a sign of doing a good job on a clean skin beaver. You shouldn't have big whack marks on all your meat and hide. That would tell me you're not using your knife control right. You should have just nice clean hide like this, maybe just a little bit of red meat that's just going to get scraped off lightly like that, but the rest of it's going to be ready to put on the stretcher. The last part we've got to do is just bring it on off his head here. So now, like I say, we're just going to, there again, keep that right tension. Just going to tease it back off his ears and his head right up here with the knife. There we go. Here's what our skin side is going to look like on a good clean skin beaver. Pretty much all we have was just a little bit of red fat meat left on it, but pretty much that beaver's ready to put on the board. No scrape, you don't have to use any scraping knife.
If you need to store your beaver before you flesh and board them, it's best to do it with unfleshed hides. Fleshed hides don't seem to freeze well. They freezer burn very easily. Hides should be wrapped first side out with no fat or skin exposed that can dry out or freezer burn. They should be double bagged in small numbers. Never pile a number of hides on top of each other in the freezer. The ones in the middle and on the bottom may very well spoil before they freeze through. Unfrozen hides can be held 4 to 5 days in a cold building or refrigerator before fleshing, but check them occasionally. Just smell the head area, as it seems to be the first area that starts to taint. When thawing the pelts, be sure to keep all the flesh area covered. If it is exposed, it will begin to dry and be more difficult to flesh. As you saw, clean skinning takes a little more time and precision, but saves the whole step of fleshing needed with rough skinning. Here are a few key points to remember when you are clean skinning. Sharpen your knife rolled out. Keep good tension on the pelt. Angle the knife down along the hide. Keep even with the skinning. As you can see, there are two very different results from both skinning methods, and each method requires different tools, using a slightly different knife angle. Beaver is another fur, like muskrat, that really benefits from drumming, and this is the best point in the handling process to do it. It is not very practical to drum your beaver pelts after they are dry, so it's never done at the auction house. Drumming not only dries, cleans, shines, and enhances the fur side of the pelt. The residual sawdust also helps dry up some of the runny fat when you are scraping the hide side on the fleshing beam. These are some comparisons of before and after and some side-by-side very noticeable differences in the appearance of the pelt. One difference with the beaver pelt is that they can be over-drummed. Beaver fur has a lot of natural oils, and over-drumming can deplete these oils in the fur. 8 to 10 minutes is just about the right time to leave the pelts in the drum.
Yeah, the green hides, raccoon, beaver, especially muskrat, go for about 8 or 10 minutes and before you flesh them.
For the same reason, unlike rats, trying to dry the pelts by drumming if you skin the beaver wet is not a good way to dry them because of the time it takes. Be sure to use good quality rolled sawdust. It's designed for fur cleaning and is available as a bagged product. One bag should clean 50 to 75 beaver, depending how dirty they are and how often you change the sawdust in your drum. Don't use the stuff under your table saw. You'll never get it out of the fur. If you clean skinned your beaver and then drummed them, you will need to be sure to scrape all the sawdust off the hide side of the pelt after you have boarded the pelt. Drumming your beaver pelts is another step in presenting the best handled pelts to both the graders and the buyers. Remember these key points when drumming your beaver. Only drum 8 to 10 minutes. Use a good quality rolled sawdust. Scrape the excess sawdust off the hide side of the pelt. If you have clean skun your beaver, You have almost all the fleshing work done. Just a little touch-up on the board is all that should be necessary. But if you have rough-skinned it, then the fun's just beginning. There are 2 different ways to flesh beaver with a knife. Over your knee, or most commonly on a beam. Using a beam requires some additional tools. Like fleshing knives, there are a lot of different brands on the market, but be certain that whatever you use is of high-quality steel. 2 of the most popular are the Necker 600 and the Caribou knife. The Necker has an edge on the convex part of the blade for cutting, and a flat edge on the concave edge for pushing off light fat. The Caribou is sharp on both edges. The real key to doing an excellent fleshing job is working with and keeping keenly sharp edges on your knives. The Howell brothers of Precision Processing, located in Mauston, Wisconsin, do tens of thousands of coon and beaver hides a season. This is how they sharpen their knives.
We started out with a Necker. There's nothing wrong with a Necker for doing 5 or 10 coon in a garage somewhere. We had a hard time keeping them sharp, and we had a hard time teaching people how to keep them sharp. What you're doing when you're fleshing like this, if you're on a beam, is you're curling this edge over. You're curling it underneath. And one way to fix that problem and to get a razor sharp edge back on your knife is to stand that lip back up, that curled over, stand it up, and then knock it down. It's hard to always keep a consistent edge with this knife, and by edge I mean razor sharp edge. We picked up a Caribou here about 3 years ago. It's a 128 CF, custom made in Canada. The 128 CFD model, it comes razor sharp on both sides, and the idea is you can dull the side down that you don't want to use for the sharp side. So we take this concave side here, and you can use a mill file. You can see this one here. I just used a sanding grinder, hand power tool, and dulled this down. You want to be careful that when you dull this sharp, because they're both sharp, when you dull this side down, you don't leave a lip left on here. You make sure it's nice and rolled off, and then you're ready to go. I got 3 different stages here of knives. This knife here was just started today. I just started using this knife. It's brand new. It's not even broke in. This knife here is just getting broke in. You can see the taper. You can see some steel's gone. And this one here has seen more. This one here has seen more hides than any other Caribou knife. I can guarantee it. It's probably seen close to 40,000 coon, probably 1,000 beaver, and that it's seen its fair share, and it's since then been retired. I'm going to tell you the unique thing about this knife, and the reason why I'll never pick up another knife is it's lightweight. And when your hands get used to these handles, you'll never go back to another handle.
One other feature Josh likes on the Caribou is the thinness of the blade. He explains the importance of that aspect.
The dull side on a blown up form, it goes up, it goes over, and it comes back down. That's what your dull side is. So when you're pushing with your dull side, what's actually doing the pushing are those corners. Well, after a couple hundred coon, what happens? Those corners start rolling over, and now you might as well just grab your mama's wooden spoon and try taking the fat off of an animal. It does not work. On this knife here, you can see after 40,000 coon, 30,000, 50,000, whatever it is, still just as thin. That steel does not get any thicker. It always stays the same. And this helps you get over the legs of the beaver. Back to sharpening these knives here. Anytime you're fleshing an animal, and I don't know if you can get me over here on the beam, when you're fleshing like this, what you're doing is you're taking a microscopic lip, almost a wire curl, and as you're fleshing, you're curling a microscopic edge that you can kind of feel, but you cannot see it. It pushes that lip underneath. So to get that wire edge to stand back up, what we used to try doing with these knives, and it didn't work, and the reason it didn't work is because the steel on here is such a high quality, we can never get that lip to stand back up. What would happen was it would actually cut into the knife. So then we went to a standard steel, and what this has on it are basically ridges in here. I'm not an expert on this, maybe a little coating of diamond dust. And what we would do was we would use this to stand the knife up, and if you can hear that, we would stand it up, knock it down, and get our lip back. Now, the problem with using a serrated steel or a diamond steel is you put the same edge on your knife, you put the same grit from this steel back on this knife. So you're basically putting a serrated edge onto this knife, and that's going to cause serious problems when you're using the sharp side of your knife. We went to a smooth steel, and they look similar. This one's a little bit worn out, but the smooth steel is exactly that. It's high carbon steel, but it's completely smooth. It's got the consistency of just a regular nail almost. Now what this does is it does everything we need it to do. It stands that edge up and knocks it down, but it doesn't put a serrated edge on it. It puts a smooth edge on it. And that's what we're trying to achieve on the edge of our fleshing knife.
Josh now explains just how he sharpens his knives.
The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put my right handle in my left hand, like this. I'm going to turn it around. And I'm going to go slow here, and you can rewind this and play it back again. It's very important that when you sharpen this knife, the way I'm going to do it, you always use the same hands every time. You don't sharpen it with this hand one time and then with this hand the next. You always want to run that wire curl the same way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this, switch your hands, and now my lip is curled completely underneath. My wire curl is completely underneath. I'm going to get this to stand back up. We want that wire curl that's underneath to stand straight back out this way by doing this. I'll do that 3 to 5 times. Now that lip that was curled under, and I can feel it here with my hands, it's pointing straight out right now. So now what we're going to do is we're going to get it to angle back down into our beam. We're going to stand it up and then knock it down. Stand it up and knock it down, and I'll show you how I do that. Right now I'm standing it up. I'm dragging it off of the steel. Now I'm turning the knife over, and at about that angle, I'm going to knock it down. 1, 2, 3, 4, dragging it away. 1, cutting into the steel. It's going to take a little practice. It's going to feel awkward. It's a different hand motion than what you're used to. Well, all we're doing is we're taking that edge that was curled underneath, we're standing it up, and we're knocking it down. Rub your hand this way. If you can feel that lip catching on your palm or on the back of your hand, it's facing in the wrong way. That means it's facing this, it's facing up. We want that to be facing just like that. We don't want it down, we don't want it curled under, we want it right here. Be very careful that when you're dragging it backwards like this, that you don't start getting into this habit. We're trying to run it flat on here. We're not trying to do this. If you do this, then you're gonna, instead of straightening it back up, you're gonna bring it all the way back up on the top side. So keep that flat and knock it down. We'll talk a little bit about is an oil stone. This really is the key to keeping a consistent edge on this knife. I only have to touch this on a stone, 80 to 150 beaver. But I'll tell you what you get with this stone when you learn how to use it is a consistently sharp knife. I'm going to show you guys what I do with this knife when I no longer have that microscopic lip. When this knife is no longer razor sharp, and I mean finger sharp, where I can flesh through gristle with my fingers, I'm going to bring it back to this stone. Here's my sharp side. This is the side I'm fleshing with. What I do is I turn it over and I run it backwards. It's the complete opposite. And by running it backwards, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a curl on the back side. And when I can feel a lip all the way across this knife, now we can start fresh again. I'm going to start right up here on the corner, right there. Now, the factory edge is this. That's holding it. I don't know if you can see that or not. This decline here, that's that factory edge. I like it just a little bit steeper. So if that's the factory edge, I pick it up just a little bit. And I run it backwards. And by doing that, I'm curling this lip back over. When the knife is brand new, you might have to run it backwards like this 20 or 30 times. When it gets into the retirement stage, you might have to do it 100 or 120 times. And it's important that you move your whole body backwards. I don't like to move just my arms because I tend to start real flat here and then kind of pick the knife up down at the end. So I move my whole upper body. People always ask me how many times I'm going to run this backwards until I can feel a lip all the way across, a good solid lip all the way across this knife. Now that we've just came off the stone with this knife and we've got a good lip all the way across the bottom, what we're going to do is we're going to get this lip to stand straight back up and we're going to knock it down again. Stand it up, knock it down. The reason we're going to do this about 30 or 40 times is because we're going to want to get the same consistency of this lip here. We want it on the smooth steel. What it has right now, it has the consistency of a medium grit stone, and we don't want that for fleshing. We don't want a coarse knife, we don't want a serrated knife, we want a smooth edge. And what we're going to do by doing this multiple times is we're standing it up, knocking it down, standing it up, knocking it down. And what we're doing is we're burnishing the steel. We're basically standing it up and knocking it down, and every time we do it, we burnish it and we harden that wire curl or that microscopic lip we were talking about. After every beaver, I'm going to do this twice. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1.
We all want to handle our fur well. It's part of being a good trapper. The right equipment helps, and knowing how to maintain it helps a whole lot more.
Key points. Square off the dull side of your knife occasionally. B. Use only a smooth sharpening steel. C. Use the same technique every time you sharpen. Blade angle is important. And D. Long, even strokes on the oil stone.
Now let's take a look at how they use their knives. Josh prefers to use a wide beam, more flat surface to shave on. He starts at the head, just behind the ears. He uses long, wide strokes to cover most of the back and remove the hard meat. As he finishes a wide swath, he moves the pelt up and continues all the way to the tail. Once he has all that cleaned, he puts the middle of the back on the point of the beam and cleans everything off over the sides, effectively cleaning across on the pelt. He uses the sharp blade on the back and turns the knife to push the soft fat along the edges. That leaves 4 wedges of flesh over each leg hole. He moves the pelt so each of these is on the flat part of the beam and shaves the leg hole, then pushes the soft fat over the hole and off the pelt. At this point, he trims off the lips and nose. Average time is around 3 minutes. This takes a lot of skill and practice, as well as sharpened fleshing knives. Another important tool for a good, clean fleshing job is the right beam. There are lots of styles and materials to choose from, but the most common one is sanded smooth and coated with polyurethane. Some guys fit PVC over the beam and in some areas cover them with heavy conveyor belt rubber to keep the surface smooth. The angle, like the width of the beam, is a matter of preference, but the width and curvature of the beam should be matched to the knife you use, and your beam should always be kept smooth, degreased, and clean. Using the beam to flesh requires some practice and getting a feel for what parts of the beaver needs to be sliced off and which can be pushed off. And later, we'll look at some other techniques that accomplished handlers use. The fat on the beaver hide works off much better and neater if the pelt is chilled before you start. Less mess. Wipe your beam down before you start and periodically while you are fleshing. Just hook the nose over the end of the beam, and because you scun it out all the way, it'll hook over the end. Clamp the edges together at the bottom of the beam. A small piece of cardboard between you and the pelt will help keep it from slipping on the beam. You can use a sharp knife or your fleshing knife to clean all the heavy fat around the jowls, face, and ears. Not too much on the ears. We will deal with them later in the boarding process.
And I just take this down around the shoulder, around the ears, and this little bit right next to the edge of the lip.
Using the sharpest edge of the knife, slice down over the shoulders and clean the heavy gristle in this area. Roll the hide on the beam and shave down the middle of the back as far as you can reach. This is where you'll get the feel for the angle you'll need when holding the fleshing knife against the hide. Continue working out to the side of the hide, then back the other way, adjusting the hide so it's taut on the beam, and so you're always working on the flat part of your beam. This will bring you down on the front leg holes. If you let the hide bunch up or any fat roll under it, it makes it very easy to cut or tear. The soft fat on the right of the leg and on younger beaver can be pushed over the legs with the dull end of your knife. If you have not clean skinned around the nipples and can't see them on the outside of the legs, be careful not to catch them with your fleshing knife and tear a hole in the pelt. Pull the pelt up and put the leg hole over the point on your beam that shortens the length of what you have to slice. The grizzle and meat on the inside of the leg holes will have to be sliced with a sharp edge. This shoulder area is also the thickest and toughest part of the pelt in older beaver, and often just filled with scars and scar tissue. It'll take some good pressure and maybe taking off several layers of tissue to get this area thinned down. Be careful not to open some of the older scars. There are two types of fat, soft and hard mixed with meat, and you can see the line between them running down from inside the front leg holes to inside the back leg holes and on off the side of the tail. If you start fleshing down the middle of the back and move toward the sides, the meat in the middle will need to be sliced, although on very small beaver it can be just pushed, and the fat on the outside of that line can be pushed off with the dull side of the knife. Be sure to keep the meat and fat cut short on the hide, so it doesn't grease up the beam and sides of the pelt. Try to push as much fat down the length of the hide and use a little sawdust when you push the fat over the fur on the edge of the hide to keep any grease out of the fur. Don't ever let the grease build up on the beam. Greasy pelts are a major problem for the graders to grade and the buyers to evaluate.
Any place I'm going to go over the fur, the hair, put a little sawdust on it before I push over. Again, the dull side, should roll that right over that leg hole. This is
Keep moving the pelt up and slicing and pushing your way down the hide to keep the beam clean and any big pieces of fat cut off. On larger beaver, you may have to move the clamp down further on the hide. Working your way down, continuing to push the soft fat off the hind legs. The other very thick and tough area is around the base of the tail. This will require some extra thinning with the sharp side so it'll dry uniformly with the rest of the pelt. The weakest point on the hide is the area that was around the vent. Now, just below the hind legs on the rim of the pelt, use a little care. This area can be torn very easily, but most of it is trimmed in the boarding. Now, take the pelt and look for any spots that you may have missed and not fleshed off well enough. The last step is to take the clamp off and push the areas around them off to the side. When you have finished fleshing, look it over again. Hold the pelt out and check for any places on the pelt that you might have missed or left some thicker fat. Go back over these or they will cause the pelt to dry unevenly and cause a fat burn before the pelt can dry. Like we said in the beginning, this DVD is not meant to be an exact blueprint on how to flesh your beaver pelts. Everyone has a little different technique that works for them. But the important part is good sharp fleshing knives and getting a feel for how to use them. This will take some time and practice. Key points for fleshing. Make sure your pelt is clean and dry and free of anything that might snag the fleshing knife. Keep your fleshing knife sharp. Keep your beam wiped down and clean of grease and fat. Slice the heavy fat and push the soft fat. Check for any thick fat you missed and reflesh.
Jackie Worse is not only a world-class beaver skinner, but is widely regarded as the best fur handler in Alberta, maybe even all of Western Canada, particularly for someone putting up the numbers he does.
How many pieces of fur do you think you handle in a season?
Well, it's around the 5 mark.
Jackie uses a fleshing technique probably as old as trapping itself. Over the centuries, many a trapper spent his nights with a beaver pelt on his knee. One of the things that makes Jackie so good at his craft is the attention he pays to his knives.
The knife has to be very, very thin.
He has a very exacting way he sharpens them, as he explains.
When I sharpen my knife, I have a motor that's sitting backwards. And as it's sitting backwards, I've made a machinist make myself a dowel. That just a grinding wheel sits in the top of it. It just sits there freewheeling. And you press your knife down. If you have too much pressure on your knife, the wheel stops. You don't want too much heat, because heat ruins the hardness of your knife.
Once the knife is honed to the thin edge, he uses the steel to just touch up the edge and roll over the burr on the off edge. But the type of steel is also important. No ridges, totally smooth.
The steel doesn't have nothing on it. It's as smooth as can be. If you keep sharpening your knife constantly on a steel, you will eventually remove the magnet that's inside the steel. You should be able to pick up some nails. And if you don't pick up no nails no more, remove the steel.
The final important step is making sure the burr on the edge is on the right side of the blade.
I have a very sharp knife. All I'm doing is putting an edge on it so that when I go down on the hide, it won't cut into the hide. I'm taking the edge of my knife and I'm pushing it up, so there's no sharp edges down here. Leaving the burr on the one side of the knife, so the other side you'll see as I'm fleshing how my knife wants to get away from the hide as it keeps going.
Before Jackie starts his fleshing, he washes the pelts and dries them thoroughly. This not only cleans the fur, but Jackie says forces a thin film of water between the flesh and the hide, making the fleshing much easier.
You want that hair staying straight up once you've washed them. Push air through the beaver for about 5 to 6 hours.
The next step is fleshing.
I always start my beaver at the head. Right behind the ears I start it. See how my knife wants to go up at all times? I'm taking that burr and I'm sending it up, away from the beaver.
The edges take a little more time, but all are done using the same technique.
A lot of guys might think my knife is laying down, but if you actually watch my knife, it's darn near standing, straight up and down. Because I'm going fast, you think it's laying down. All my trimming is done on my knee. That's where the casters were. You're removing that white. That's the softest part on the beaver, right there. So that's where you have to be very careful.
That's right above the hind leg, between the hind leg and the back.
Yes, I'm just cleaning my front leg backwards, and I'm going pretty slow because I told you how the edge of my knife is. And the edge of my knife is totally different when I get to the front legs. I do all my other like this, but only at a slower pace. I do my wolves like this. I do my bears like this.
How many beaver do you usually do a year?
Oh, 2,000, 3,000 in that area. That's what puzzles a lot of guys. I've never caught a beaver in my life.
Jackie Wirth has taken an age-old trapper's craft and turned it into an art form. Before he boards his beaver, Jackie also sews all the leg holes. It may be old school, but it does a beautiful job. We asked Jackie what type of needle he uses.
That is a veterinarian needle. Like the straight one, you'd have a tendency of going through your finger.
And he has a little trick for tying the knot in the end of his string. Here's a few of his tips on that.
All you need to do is grab the string, go around your finger once and turn it down. And just tighten on it. You got that nut. That won't pull through. And the more stitches you do, the better your leg will close up. As closest to the hole as possible as you can go. Try to go triple loop. Triple loop will never open up. where a single and a double will.
Jackie has perfected the handling of beaver, and he's not too bad at sharpening a knife either. Key points. A thin-bladed knife works best, and hone it lightly. B, use a smooth magnetized steel. C, blade angle is important when fleshing. D, last stroke on the steel rolls the edge up. And E, use a curved veterinary needle for sewing and triple loop the knots.
Nail it down, start her out.
Mike Michaud is from northern New Brunswick and has a unique way of fleshing his beaver as he is nailing it on the board. Mike learned this technique, like lots of trappers, from his father.
He taught me how to use the knife. Back then, we didn't use the beam. The beam didn't even exist for them.
Mike likes a particular style knife.
This is just a post knife. It's quite sharp. I like it because it's a sort of a flexible knife, so you can get the feel of when you're on your fur.
And as with all knives, the edge is important.
All I do is I pass it on my queue de roi. I don't know what you call it in English. Me, it's a queue de roi.
And starts by removing the ears on the pelt.
I like to start off by cutting the ears off my beaver.
Mike then tacks out the head.
Nail it down, start her out.
Mike starts on the edge of the lip.
Keep your knife as flat as possible. See the same thing I was saying over here on my ear? See that cartilage? I took the inside of the ear off, so now all I have to do is I just cut that right out. There's no more resistance.
From there, he works down the side of the pelt. The important part is to keep the pelt tight, nailing it out as he works down the pelt. And he much prefers to work with a pelt that is quite warm and loose.
That way it works even better, because you can get under it and get into it easier. Your knife just sort of cuts like in cutting butter. Another thing you have to watch out for is the scars.
Scars require a little different technique.
You have to be careful because your knife always has a tendency to go into the scar. This scar right here, for sure, on the beam, I would have opened it. I would have made a hole.
The legs need to be handled a little different.
I've got a leg hole right here.
And again, it is very important to keep the pelt tight. And even the best handlers have a slip once in a while.
Maudit tabarnak, j'ai fait un trou.
Once he clears the legs, he can clean the rest of the pelt in a very short time.
I'm going to show you guys how I do it. I'm going to go at my normal speed to show you that is one of the reasons why I do it on the boards. It's so quick for me.
Mike finishes the pelt low on the back.
I do about 200 to 300 every season. I do a lot for my friends, so I usually do all the fleshing part and they do all the nailing down. Makes it quicker, and we do 20 to 30 in about 3 hours.
All that is left to do is to finish nailing up. Mike just fills in between the stretching nails about 1 inch apart. Then a little final scraping to clean up any fat and juice left on the pelt.
I like to finish off with my scraper.
And trimming up the head.
Never cut down like this right on the board.
One last step.
And the last part I like to do is I always like to lift my beavers on the nails.
Mike's technique is a little different, but just as effective. Remember, the end result is what's important. Key points. A flexible round-bladed knife seems to work best. B, flesh the pelt warm. C, keep the pelt stretched tight. And D, lift the finished pelt on the nails. The Cree of the James and Hudson's Bay not only harvest some of the highest quality beaver in all of North America, but are widely regarded as some of the very best beaver handlers. In a land that has only seasons, with the beaver not only as a dependable source of food since time immemorial, but as a major trade item since the 1500s, they long ago mastered the finest points of handling their pelts. We have all seen the traditional hooped beaver, such an iconic symbol of trappers, a link to our past. But this is where it began. And for Luke and Gertie Diamond of Waskaganish on the James Bay, this is just the way it's done. It's the way it's always been done. Luke and Gertie are direct descendants of the natives that traded beaver at the Hudson's Bay Company's first trading post at Fort Charles in 1668. In their 70s, they spend most of the winter in their bush camp. Luke and his son Victor are accomplished trappers, and handling their fur is a skill passed from generation to generation. It is done as the Cree have done for hundreds of years. This is a look at some of those skills. Beaver are skinned using a combination of a bone skinner and a knife. It's done very slowly and methodically, cleaning and skinning as they go. Once the pelt is removed from the carcass, Gertie trims any excess fat and meat that may have been missed in the skinning.
Gertie's going to show you how to do the next step, okay?
Gertie removes the ears and the fat around them, and then trims off the lips and the nose. The pelt is then stretched on hoops made of brown ash in the southern part of Cree country, birch, spruce, and larch in the north.
These are, they are another tree, we will same with the bottom, same one. We will have tree of the shrub on this side, we will bottom tree. We will have the top.
Starting with anchoring the leg, all four are tied off evenly. This centers the pelt. It is stitched in sections to keep it even in the hoop. Before stringer twine was available, babiche made of caribou hide was used for stitching the beaver hides on the hoops. This is the same material the natives used for filling snowshoes and making nets. Then it's all gone around again and tightened. Gertie sews up the leg holes.
I have to drag I caught 14 beaver. 14? Yep. I was so tired.
Then thoroughly soaks and washes the hide side of the pelt. This not only cleans the pelt, but re-wets the hide so it will freeze more thoroughly and evenly. The hoops are then taken outside. Temperature must be below -10 Celsius, 15 Fahrenheit, to freeze the hide.
It has to be over -10.
The timing is important. Too long, and the hide starts to dry.
When they're frozen right away, so it's better. Dry here, it doesn't work as good.
Not enough, and the hide won't clean up. Once the hide is properly frozen, it is gone over with a scraper, either one made of bone or of a flat, sharpened piece of metal. And like all knives, the edge is critical. Luke explains the technique.
Not so sharpened on this side here, only on this side. I have to use a harder steel. So it's you do it once in a while. When it doesn't. When you do this, seem to stick right into the hide. This side is drier and it doesn't work as good. You just there's some meat on it. As soon as it take off the meat and you stop, where it's thick, you scrape more. Here it's thicker, but along the sides it's thin. You don't have to scrape it because it's already clean. This side I have to do it more here again. See this fat? Little meat.
Luke recalled as a boy, all the scrapings were saved and fried in a pan on the camp stove as a treat for the children who helped with the pelt preparation. Once the pelts are scraped, they can either be left to dry or taken back out into the sub-freezing and allowed to freeze dry. This takes longer, but the end result is the most beautiful, pure white hide that is so symbolic of the Cree, their timeless connection to the beaver, and a testament to their skills as fur harvesters.